Transmitting from the Mojave Wilderness in Joshua Tree, California, now is the time for Desert Oracle Radio, the voice of the desert.
Night has fallen on the Mojave, and here we are, ready for... I don't know, what are we ready for? Summer, I guess. The swamp cooler is already running. Cool your whole house for $1 a day. Up here in the high desert, you know, we get 3 seasons of absolute beauty and perfection. I'm talking about autumn, I'm talking about winter, I'm talking about spring. And then you get to the summertime. Oh, there are good things about the summertime, I've heard. The swimming pools open up at the high schools so adults can stay in their lane, as they say, and swim back and forth with other people swimming back and forth. It's just like being on the I-10 down in Palm Springs, but better for your heart. But we'd better get used to it, so check your swamp cooler pads and get ready to get baked. You know the kind of stuff we love on Desert Oracle Radio. We like strange scenes. We like ancient and modern mysteries. The overwhelming wild landscape of the American West. Mystics and prophets and serial killers and nutcases of all sorts, all stripes. And especially we like the invisible lines that often connect the special worlds. And when that's the sort of stuff that makes your heart sing, then you are going to be a lifetime reader of Eric Davis. As Eric with a K, the host of the immensely valuable Expanding Mind podcast and the author of many books, all of which deserve a place upon the shelves of anyone who shares these interests. The new book is called High Weirdness, and it's about an interesting time when the real and the unreal began merging, when the unreal began revealing itself as very real indeed. Eric Davis, welcome to Desert Oracle Radio.
It's great to be here, Ken.
Well, I
can still remember the first time.
You still remember?
Gave me a copy of Desert Oracle. I was just elated. There was an elation inside, a sense of space and possibility, a familiarity and a challenge. It was wonderful.
You're trained for that.
It's true. I do like me some secret codes.
You are about to go on the road to promote a book that I have been anxiously awaiting, and that is no exaggeration, because it is a time that fascinates me more than just about any other time in history, and it happened in California in the early 1970s mostly. Can you tell us a little bit about the book that's coming out?
Absolutely. So it started out as a dissertation about Philip K. Dick, and particularly about the crazy experiences that happened to him in the early 1970s. Like, I was less interested in his literature and more in his experience and how he wrote his way through trying to understand what happened to him. Then just when I was about to start the dissertation, I said, you know what? I don't want to spend the next 3 years inside of Philip K. Dick's brain. I will never come out. So I pulled back at the last minute and went, you know, one of the funny things about his experience, 2374, ballast, pink light, all that stuff, is that it's kind of similar to some other stuff that I've been interested in for a very long time, like the weird Sirius transmissions that Robert Anton Wilson experienced also in California, roughly similar time. You know, Tim Leary in prison had these weird transmissions from Sirius that he might have been making up, and it's still the same kind of stuff. Terrence McKenna down there in the jungle, a little bit earlier, but the same sort of mixture of science fiction and cybernetics and esotericism and psychedelic weirdness and synchronicity, and it's like this kind of stuff. It's sort of like religion, and it's sort of like craziness, and it's sort of like fiction or science fiction. It's sort of like magic, but it's sort of it's a mixture of all these. And I went, you know, it's a much more interesting question rather than just writing about this one crazy guy, to write about a number of crazy guys and then try to say what connects them, or why is there this sense of similarity. So I chose to focus on Dick, Robert Anton Wilson, and Terence McKenna. And then I kind of embed their stories in an account of the early 70s. And like you, I've been obsessed with the 70s since college. There was a little crew of us who actually put out a zine about the 70s because we were all really interested in it for different reasons, but we overlapped in our love and our sense that the 70s still have not gotten proper treatment. People don't grok the 70s. They think smiley faces, they think shag carpet, big mustaches, maybe disco ball, and those are all appropriate, but it's much deeper. It's a very mysterious, esoteric, creepy, prophetic decade that I think has more resonance, not necessarily in a happy way, but more resonance with our time now than any other moment in American history. So I think it's really important to really grok the 70s as much as you can. And my route was to take on these wild and weird experiences and these outlandish men and try to just sort of figure out what happened to them, or at least how they thought about what happened.
Well, it feels to me that that time was a time of Gnostic awakening, and it was in a fairly small group of people, but they all had incredible influence over culture and academics and technology. Did you see anything like that in your studies?
Yes, very much. I mean, I one way I think of saying what happened is that partly through psychedelics and partly through the changing sort of religious culture or spiritual seeker culture, occult revival, which is a big part of the early 70s. All these things combined to create a situation where lots of people were having extraordinary experiences, and that's what I call them. I don't say they're spiritual, I don't say they're psychotic, I say they're extraordinary. And they were having these extraordinary experiences, but kind of outside of any context other than this crazy mixed up counterculture, which is itself so full of all these different ideas that it's like, what does it mean to have an experience outside of a religious tradition in this kind of period of time? And it makes for a lot of weirdness. And for me, like, I really take the term seriously. Like, part of what my project is in the book is to put some theoretical and historical heft onto this category of weirdness, which we often use. We say some experience is weird, or a person is weird, or something comic book we read was weird, but we don't really think about what we mean by it. And I think there's a lot hidden in that term, and that a lot of it was really prevalent in this particular time. It was influential. The last chapter of my book, I kind of trace some of the connections between these, again, very countercultural characters living in the fringe, kind of, poor or stealing drugs or whatever they're doing. They're not like major players in the culture. And yet they were very influential, and those influences went into Silicon Valley. They had to do with the early internet culture, and just kind of fed into the zeitgeist in a way that makes us have to take them seriously as really central crafters, in some sense, of this peculiar conundrum we find ourselves in today.
Now, talking about that intellectual scene and early internet in Silicon Valley reminds me of Jacques Vallée, who was there present in that scene and is now still here, present in this revival of UFO interest that's happening. And he seems to be kind of on that same steady course, even if it doesn't really get through. I wonder, did you come across any of Dr. Vallée interacting with these people?
Absolutely. In fact, he's featured centrally in my conclusion, where I try to at least gently begin to wrap up all the tendrils that connect these people. I didn't end up coming up with a really big idea about why everything was sort of similar between these stories, but I did draw a bunch of network connections, and he plays a very significant role in Robert Anton Wilson's story, because in a nutshell, Wilson is experimenting with meta-programming, John Lilly's idea of kind of crafting the beliefs that then constitute your lived experience, tons of LSD, tantric sex, and Crowleyan magic. So Wilson is really putting the pedal to the metal on extraordinary experience, and lo and behold, at one point, it just goes, a little far. And for quite a period of time, he's convinced that he's in communication with these intelligent forces associated with the star system in Sirius, and there's all these synchronicities in his life. And he's basically kind of, after maintaining a kind of clever, ironic, do I believe it, do I not believe it, sort of meta-awareness about his own wild experiences, he starts to actually kind of buy it and sort of loses the plot. So he, at the end of his account of this in Cosmic Trigger, he has to say, well, how did he get out? Because he got out. He says he's in Chapel Perilous, this place of ontological ambiguity where you either come out skeptical agnostic or a stone cold paranoid, and he managed to get back to agnostic. And one of the key features of his sort of healing or his escape is an encounter with Jacques Vallée, and it's a very interesting one. I won't go into all the details. They're at a party for Aleister Crowley's birthday, and he tells the story to Vallée, and Vallée's response is very interesting, because he doesn't say, dude, you're projecting, you've lost the plot, get back to reason, whatever, calm down, stop taking the drugs, whatever. Instead, he suggests that the worldview that Wilson is in, where there are these aliens communicating with him and all these synchronicities, is itself just part of a larger kind of story or conspiracy that he must be very aware of. That in a way, he was like taking the bait by thinking that it was the way that he thought it was. So it's actually not really a very comforting answer, and yet somehow it jarred Wilson into this sort of agnostic, open-minded, mischievous, pleasant, avuncular character that we know and love. So Vallée plays a very significant role in his story, and then, of course, a very significant role in the connection between this consciousness underground or Aquarian conspiracy that's bubbling up in California in the 70s, and the emergence of the ARPANET, the internet, computer conferencing, and eventually becoming a VC in Silicon Valley. So he's at a very interesting, weird place. And I've been able to hang out with him a few times. Never felt like we were really, getting down and rolling up our sleeves and drinking a beer kind of connection. But, I've had the opportunity to hang out with him for a few times. And very interesting character. You never quite know exactly what he holds, what he really thinks is going on, if he even knows what he really thinks is going on, but the resonances are significant. So I think it also has something to do with the whole emergence of the network as an idea, as a technology, as a way of organizing social behavior, and we're kind of now sort of going through the sort of toxic intensification of all these network effects that maybe at other stages of its emergence had different kinds of visions in store for people. And I think that some of these stories from the 70s actually give us a window into this early network consciousness that is bubbling up and to some extent being engineered.
That network consciousness from a lot of these characters, including, I was just reading V. Vale's new research, published a 1985 interview with Robert Wilson. Is very interesting. He's talking about John Lilly trying to set up a bunch of network machines in his house, and because he has interesting people visit his home. So the idea is, well, why not have all these terminals so the interesting people are always there? And it's pretty utopian. Yeah. But then we're where we are now, and it's like, well, it's the same stuff. What went wrong?
That is the million-dollar question, and I'm of two minds about it. I mean, there's a lot of things I could say about what, where, and why, and how it went wrong, but I think there's two basic reactions to this problem. One is that we were all duped all along, that it was inevitable that the forces of surveillance technology, the military-industrial state, advanced capitalism, bad consciousness, bad faith, that all of those things, entertainment, distraction, the crap of America, the immense nasty karma of this land, were going to win and be the major forces, and that we were fools to believe, as I did. I wouldn't say I was a believer, but I was definitely into a lot of more utopian ideas around early networking and early computers, and I would say I maybe sipped rather than drank the Kool-Aid out here in California. But I tend to think that it's sort of like this sort of parallel universe problem that unfortunately there were a number of possibilities. There were a wide variety of potential futures, forks in the road, bifurcations in information space. And, kind of the way you go like, 2000 election, almost went, no, we lost it. Could have been, probably in some parallel universe right next door. It wasn't the Bush man. But we unfortunately wound up in the dystopian scenario where actually the text to be reading to prepare for this moment were not John Lilly and Raw, although he was dark enough sometimes and paranoid enough sometimes that it does sort of work, but it's really kind of more of a cyberpunk reality that we're in, which is another sort of 1980s matrix that surrounded the enthusiasm around technology, but was always much more bleak and realistic about the forces of capitalism and control. And so here we are, and then what do we do with these utopian ideas? They look completely silly now. Or another way of saying is they're actually not silly, they're just we can't implement them given the current platform, which is this platform of advanced surveillance capitalism.
Right, which is a control system. So it's a control system, and we did not write in a way to omit the control system from the network.
Yeah, and there's a lot of inertia. Even as there's a lot of disruption, there's a lot of inertia. While I remain cautiously hopeful about certain ways of eluding this thing, it looks pretty rough. So there really were good ideas about how to augment human intelligence and human sociality, and how to, even if you wanted to be a capitalist, produce new interesting things through that process rather than making human beings themselves the raw material of capitalist extraction. But maybe that was also in the cards. My approach in the book is really that if we're going to figure out where we're going, we do have to have a better sense of where we came from and how these things happened, and how the technology is always haunted. It always has a demonic, enchanted side, and some of it's creepy and kind of demonic and manipulative, and some of it is very hopeful and exuberant and celebratory, and that it's a good thing to kind of call up those resonances now, because I think it's pretty clear that even though the technology is permeating our lives with algorithms and post-human processes that are technological and digital and in nature, that at the same time our sense of reality is starting to mutate and melt down and become haunted and spooky and bizarre and weird, and that we have to embrace that weirdness, go through that weirdness, not hide from that weirdness. And so that's the way that the stories I tell in this book, which are mostly historical, largely historical, I think are really feeding into our moment. There's this sense of the technology kind of entering into the mystery or the spookiness that's haunting the scene, and that's all part of that emergence of network consciousness. It's like that book Uri. To read that book by
I was going to ask you about Uri Geller because of the Nine. Nine must show up in your book.
Actually, I didn't go into the Nine because I was at the conclusion. I thought I was going to get to these interconnections in the main parts of the book, but I ended up just spending so much time on these individual figures and their stories that I didn't really get to that until this conclusion. And there's enough there, and I'm like, it's too long, and it's such a can of worms. But I do talk about the Stargate conspiracy and this idea, which I think is very worth contemplating, that there was sort of a meta-narrative that was being woven in the 70s about alien contact, about incorporeal forms of intelligence that had something to do with Egypt and something to do with the occult. And it doesn't really ever quite cohere, but it was clearly a very popular meta-narrative. And there's a sense that it's sort of being worked, that it's not just a spontaneous upwelling from the people. And that in itself is part of the vibe of the era, is that there's a sense of kind of engineering behind the veil, that something's being woven together. And I think that's part of what network consciousness is that once you become aware that society is also a network, that it's being, sort of technically woven together from multiple points of view with multiple agendas, that the very stories we tell through the day take on this kind of weirdly engineered quality. Or perhaps it was being, like they say in the Stargate conspiracy, that it was just, there was some plot, by a variety of figures to kind of weave together some transpersonal new age, meet the aliens kind of mind frame. But when I look at the experiences of the people that I'm talking about, I don't think they're dupes. I don't think they were being beamed signals from the military intelligence. So there was something about these sort of patterns that were coming up in the unconscious or the collective unconscious to try to make sense of the major changes that were underway in the era, not just with the emergence of network technology, but all sorts of stuff, technology, UPC codes, we start scanning on the inside, and then we're sending out machines into the cosmos. Like, right. What's that? Like, who's going to hear that? Like, I'm not saying that there are cosmic entities who are responding to that, but in the collective mind, we have now sent a beacon or a number of beacons out to Jupiter, to Saturn, and there's some kind of reverberation. And whether that's from cosmic forces or from our own cultural narratives, it's really hard to say, because we're in this zone where we can't really exactly finally tell the source of things. At least I don't believe so, most of the time anyway. A lot of these deeper mysteries, in a way, like a lot of times people write a big book. It's a big book. We've been working on it for 8 years. And some of the stuff in it's been with me for decades. It's a personal magnum opus kind of thing. A lot of stuff in it. But in a way, I feel like I'm just clearing my throat. Like, I'm just like, okay, we got that out of the way. Now let's talk about the really hard stuff to think about, which is the stuff about social control. Where do these beliefs come from? How do we explain synchronicities? How do we explain people having, similar types of experiences in different places? A lot of the issues that come up with UFO narratives. How do we do this without becoming stone cold paranoid or being so agnostic that we don't really take a lot of evidence or experience seriously, and so we stay in our little rationalist cubby holes? How do we really move forward with these bigger questions? And on that score, I just scratched the surface. I just kind of set stuff in motion, or I laid out a kind of platform for a whole other set of investigations.
So would this be like volume 2?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing next. Who knows?
Maybe a new Bible of some kind?
No, nothing like that. I'm not going to write a Bible. But I'm also, I love history. I love countercultural history. There's tons of it. There's so many byways to explore and artifacts to collect and stories to tell. And, people are dying. It's time to get on it, whatever. But I'm also aware that I don't want to be writing and focusing too much on the past, because we're in a pretty creepy moment and a lot going on, and it seems like there's sort of a call to try to stay awake in the present moment. And even though I love this stuff, there's also a way in which it's like, okay, what's it going to tell you now? And that's the one other reason that I wrote the book, and I'm happy it's coming out now, is that there's this psychedelic renaissance, and we read about psychedelics in the New Yorker and the New York Times, and there's this whole medicalized language that's like, oh, these are going to help us deal with PTSD and end-of-life anxiety and all these problems, and it's partly because we're in a mental health crisis in the United States
Yes.
and in the world, and there's been no good meds since SSRIs, which aren't that good, and that was 40 years ago. So, we're like kind of like in a crisis, like, oh my God, what are you going to do with all these people? So it's like, oh, look, psychedelics, that'll help. And so there's all these stories coming out about this healing power, and people have these mystical experiences of oneness, and then they're healed of their fear and their PTSD. They confront their PTSD, and they have these things. And I have no doubt that tons of healing does happen through psychedelics. But to tell that story and to make it a mainstream story absolutely requires that the people who are now trying to be the power elite in psychedelics, the doctors, the therapists, the insurance people, the corporate people who are trying to privatize certain psychedelic medicines or turn them into medicines, those guys, they have to repress and erase the rich and bizarre history of countercultural psychedelia. And I will not let that happen.
Good.
I'm going to keep yelling that story from the rafters until they take me down, because I'm like, look, whatever else you want to say, healing, sacred, neuroplasticity, fed up, psychoanalysis, whatever you want to say, the one thing about psychedelics is that they're really weird.
Yes.
And you have to take that on in its own terms.
You are going to go out on the road with this book, and I believe you're going to be in Los Angeles on June 8th. Is that correct?
Yeah, June 8th and June 9th. I'm doing reading at Skylight Books on Saturday at 5, and then I'm doing a talk. Both free events, free. That's right, people, free. And then I'm doing a talk at Zebulon Cafe on Sunday.
And we can find out more about this stuff where? Your website on the evil corporate internet.
Yes, the evil corporate internet, techgnosis.com, still holding on to that old name, TECHGNOSIS, and there's an events listings there, and you can find out more about stuff there.
Good. We'll have links on the Desert Oracle website as well. It is always a pleasure, and I always have about 1,000 more questions whenever I talk to you, so I hope we do it again soon. And good luck with this book. I'm waiting for the UPS driver to drop it on my porch any day now.
Beautiful, man. You're going to have a nice ride. I promise you that.
Thank you to Eric Davis. The book is called High Weirdness, and it is out now. From Amboy to Zzyzx and across the Great Mojave Wilderness, this has been Desert Oracle Radio. I'm your host, Ken Lane. We broadcast from KCDZ-FM in Joshua Tree. Thanks to Eric Davis, and thanks to Red, Blue, Black, Silver for the sounds. And good night from the voice of the desert.